Hey guys, we have a new documentary streaming on demand at merkelfilms.com. It's called The Sierra Sounds, A Prelude. This is a short documentary that we're releasing on the website for your pleasure. We have Ron Moorhead going back to the Sierra Nevada mountains to revisit the groundbreaking location where he recorded the Sierra Sounds. This short documentary is now streaming on demand at merkelfilms.com.
This entity, it moves in these flashes of light, right? Its signature characteristic is madness. Like any of these entities that I see and deal with, like their eyes are where it's particularly different, right? Like the nature of an entity that is dark, you can tell because its eyes are, I don't know if it's like a source of power, or it's where they pull you in or whatever, but like every entity that I've come up against, it's like when I look at its eyes, I can tell what type of attacks it goes through, what sort of nature it is based on what pervades from it. And I've come up and dealt with those particular things in a very direct way for quite a while. And Cernunnos was one of them. It resides over St. Louis area. I'm not sure exactly how far it spreads, but it brings people into this stagnation and madness, and you see signs of that. And I think it's really interesting that just across the river in Illinois, there is the Cahokia Mounds, right? Like it's one of the biggest Native American settlements of the mound builders. And it's sitting right on top of East St. Louis, which is notorious for its danger and its, murder rate and property crime rate, so it's interesting that the closer these things are to these areas, it seems like the more you see negative effects of it popping forward, right? During this confrontation, which lasted about 6 months, where I was dealing with this entity, I was at work one day and I was pulled out of my body and snapped back in.
Like quickly, like you were pulled out of your body and then snapped back into your body, like real fast, or
like the occult calls it the astral cord, right? It's like, so I was in my body. It had, it was like March. It had been raining or something like that, and I was stepping across a puddle, and I felt myself leave. I looked at my body from about 5 feet away, and I snapped back in, and I felt myself hit my own body, and it was like running into a brick wall for a minute.
Well, it's working now. Hopefully it stays working. Those gremlins, man. You brought them with you.
I am, they follow me a little bit. There's a lot of, so everybody has like a type of, electromagnetic field they put out, right? And it seems like when I do things like this, technology has a hard time working. Like there's a lot of interference, like anything from a phone call to TV doesn't work. Like, I've had an immense amount of difficulty with things that are electronic. Like I have to keep things as simple as possible because I don't like to rely on technology because it fails when it shouldn't.
Yeah.
Around me, it's it's a very interesting, I don't know, phenomenon, but it seems like the further I go in my life, the more disruptive it is around technology for me. So it can be, interesting.
We kind of had that experience on our first recording.
Yep.
First of all, welcome from Colorado. So
it's warmer here, man.
Yeah, definitely from Colorado for sure. You guys got those mountains out there that are, probably nice and chilly right now. You guys have snow and all.
I had 3 feet of snow already.
Are you serious?
Oh yeah.
Wow. Yeah, no snow here yet. Hopefully we keep it that way. I'm still waiting on my first winter in the South with no snow. The first 2 winters we had snow and I didn't like it. So, anyways, welcome. And the reason why you're even here in person is because we tried doing this remotely and there were issues. I think we only got through like half a half an hour of recording before I was like, you know what? This isn't working.
Like 20 minutes or something.
What was the issue? Do you remember?
Your camera went out and then the call dropped and then the app, whichever one it is that you use to record, it stopped working on me.
That's right.
It was just started out kind of light and then it just snowballed.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and we hear, different stories on the show that tend to have the electronic gremlins following them,
Yeah.
And that was definitely the case last time. And we're not off to a great start today. I mean, like we were getting ready to start recording, and my ear headphones went out, and it's working now, so hopefully it stays up. Because if it goes off, I might just have to take off my headphones, which is no good for me because it's weird. You podcast for 8 years with headphones on. It's hard to not hear
adjust to it, yeah.
You and me in my ears.
Right.
But the reason why you and I connected initially is because you had heard episode 694, Dark Shift, and you're like, well, that's relatable. And you're like, I've heard this before, as in my life, and that's been a common theme with some people reaching out and stuff since then, which I had a suspicion would happen. And some people are reaching out to say, they've had different aspects of experiences that equate to that story. I just talked to a woman last week who she has, after hearing that, reached out to me just to confirm that she has such experiences to a certain extent. And so I invited her on the show. We recorded. And she said that a lot of her stuff is that within the dream state, lucid dreaming.
Sure.
And she wound up interacting with this ancient Mayan god, Cosmataz, I think is how you pronounce it.
Sounds right.
And yeah, sure. And it's like this bat wing god that works for the underworld or guards the underworld, I think it is. And then in another dream that she didn't even remember, the day that we sat down to record, she's going through this dream journal that she has. She said, I don't really keep up on it. I'm really bad with it. And she said that I came across a dream in here that I wrote down that I don't even remember dreaming, and I don't remember writing this. And she reads it to me, and she says that basically in this dream, she came across a three-headed dragon, or like the way she said it was like a three-headed dragon or a type of dragon dog. And she said that it was interacting with, I think she said it was the ruler over Hades, or something like that. It was like basically Satan, the idea of Satan. And she described him, I think, having black skin, if I remember correctly. But when I started, because I'm not up to date on Greek mythology, right? So I looked up, three-headed dragon at first, and three-headed dog, and Cerberus, yeah.
Yep.
And so I'm literally sitting there reading about Cerberus, and I've seen it in Hercules movie when I was a kid, the Disney version.
Yeah.
But I'm sitting there reading about it, and she's reading out of her dream journal that she didn't remember writing, didn't remember this dream, and she goes, in my dream, I think its name was called Cerberus. And I was like, I stopped her. I was like, do you know what Cerberus is? And she's like, no, that's the name that I felt like I had in the dream, I guess. And I said, hang on a second. So I screen shared with her, and I was like, this is what I'm looking at right now. And I'm like, a three-headed dog called Cerberus that serves. And she's like, holy crap. I was like, yeah. So there's a lot more to the dream realm than what people, I think, give credit to. But also the reality of the dream realm, where just because you think it's a dream doesn't mean it was all fiction.
Right.
And we can go into so many different directions with that. I even came across a guy recently who scientifically apparently has been able to hack people's brains and communicate with them while they're in REM sleep. And it's like what he can send them messages. And
yeah.
It's pretty wild. But anyways, you're here because you have a lot of similar experiences. And so we were kind of brainstorming before we started recording. If you could just kind of start off with the overview of how this kind of all started for you, because I kind of stopped you and I was like, whoa. That sounds like I want that recorded. So.
Yeah. I have had a life full of paranormal experience. Like it's not uncommon to me for the paranormal to be more real than the real. You know, it's like I think about just kind of different points in my life, and I can see forces of both darkness and light in both places, right? Like throughout the whole time. I grew up in a haunted house. My dad was kind of plagued by madness a little bit, and it definitely showed. You know, like I grew up. There was one point when I was like, I don't know, 8 or something like that. There was a particular memory I have. I was waiting for my parents to get home. They were out on like a date night or something, and I remember looking out of my bedroom window, and there's this giant bat creature that just flies, and there's a house across the street, and it just flies, and it sits on this electrical box, right? And it's just staring at me, and it's probably 8 or 9 feet tall. You know, furry. It's got dark red eyes, and they're luminescent, but they're not like glowing from their own source of light. You know what I mean? And I remember looking at it, and I wasn't ever afraid of that stuff. Like it never scared me. But it was something that I definitely recognized that other people didn't see.
How old are you when you started realizing that?
Oh gosh, like 8 maybe. You know, it's in my adult life, I could say that would be similar to what Mothman is described as.
Yeah.
And I hadn't even thought about that till just now. But it's, you know, there was a point where
So you're saying you never thought about that until just now?
Till just now.
Really?
Yes. I was like, oh, I guess that kind of looks like Mothman.
Yeah,
it's
a lot.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm stunned by that.
You know, and I find it interesting that stuff like that would happen to me all the time. And as I grew up, because of the turmoil that there was in my house, I grew up in a church, but they weren't, you know, it was in the early 2000s, and it was very Baptist or you know, whatever. So there was a lot of, like, you know, the doctrine of cessationalism. It's like, you know, the spiritual gifts aren't active, they're not working anymore. There's some that aren't intended for today at all. And you know, that was back in the days when it was like the paranormal is not real. You know, everyone was treating it like it was foolishness or the workings of a deluded mind rather than something that is real, right? And it wasn't until about 7 years ago or something like that I was at a point in my life where I was plagued by a variety of different things, and I was prepared to end my life, right? To be done with everything. And I remember I told God, if you're real, then I want you, and you have to be real. This is my last go around, my last attempt. And if you're not who you say you are, then I'm done, you know? And it's one of those things, you got to be careful what you pray for because he showed up in a big way, and he hasn't stopped showing up since. And as I've progressed down that road, you know, it's like the amount of spiritual warfare that I can look back on now and recognize that I'm like, oh, okay, this is all stuff that's been going on throughout my whole life. I'm like, it is a part of my ordained purpose, right? Is to be someone who walks in both worlds. And I have a certain gift set that protects me from the usual negative aspects of that dark side. Like, I've been in the catacombs of the undead. I've been pursued by hellhounds. I've been in these ancient forests where, like, all of a sudden, like I'll be, you know, I was driving across Kansas, right? And I look up, and all of a sudden on the horizon, there's this gigantic tree that is like 400 feet tall and 100 feet wide, and it's just sitting on the horizon. And so I have this, I don't know, nature where I'm kind of here but not here, and I'm kind of there but not there, if that makes sense. And so like the way that I experience things is both physical and not, and metaphysical and not. And it's like, so I see stuff that other people don't. Like I've seen shadow figures, I've seen the Hat Man, who I had a much more concentrated fight against at a different point. Like there's so many different areas I could go. It's like, but as I've gone through my life, I've come to recognize that the Lord has ordained me for warfare on a very direct and confrontational, or of a direct and confrontational type to the enemy. And so, my life is his, and I just go where he tells me to go, and I do what he tells me to do, and it works out,
Wow. All right. So that's a great primer. And, I'm really glad you're here because, you drove 24 hours essentially,
something like that.
And I'm really grateful that you got here. I was going to fly you, but you said flying doesn't work out for people like you. So
there's a whole story about that.
You're like, I was like, I was going to fly you out, and you're just like, actually, it's probably safer if I drive.
more likely that I'll get here.
That's wild. So, are you familiar with the guy I've had on the show twice now, Nathan Reynolds? Okay. The way you just kind of talked about the, it's almost like you've been commissioned to have a direct interaction and conflict with this stuff. It almost sounds like him. He's never said it like that, but that's kind of like what you described is almost like him too. Did you ever, when you listen to his stuff, feel like it's relatable at all to you?
Oh yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff. It's interesting to me that like his story, there's a lot of points in it that I relate to, and the as a bit of a backstory for it, like I would say at this point that I have the equivalent of a very unorthodox seminary level education in a variety of different topics. There was one point pretty quickly after my conversion that I was asking God, I'm like, can I go to seminary? Can I go do that stuff? And he told me no. And I remember as I was going through stuff, he told me, I am your teacher, rely on me. And where he leads me in information that I study and that I learn about, sometimes goes to some really dark places, and can be very dangerous for anybody to go to. So Nathan Reynolds, and your show in general, has been a huge resource that the Lord has used for me to teach me about things and to connect different points. And I think that you do extremely important work, because it gives the capability for people to start drawing lines and recognize that what they consider to be like a false world is more real than this world. Like the spiritual world is more real and just as permanent as this world. It's like you can think about it through the lens of like it's a different dimension or whatever. But it's like the way that I think about it is that the Bible talks about three heavens, or so you have earth, you have the second heaven, which is where these entities reside, right? Like they come in through it, there's portals through it, there's I don't know, it's different over there. It's really, really strange. And then there's the third heaven, which I've also been to, and it's also very different, especially from the second heaven and especially from the first heaven. And so the second heaven is where a lot of this stuff goes on, but people discount their experiences with it because it feels so different. Like the laws of physics are different there. The way time moves is different there. The air itself feels different, breathes different. The ground moves. I don't know. It's a weird place, because it's corrupted, right? And so you have
the second heaven is corrupted.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the way I picture it is like everything that we see exists in the second heaven, but it overlays right on top of it. And there's places in it that you don't see here. kind of, it's this idea of like you almost have like an expanded vision of some areas. Like if you had like a Venn diagram, it's like there's places where it overlaps and there's certain things that are unique to each, right? But we don't war against flesh and blood. We war against principalities and spirits and entities in the second heaven. And it's like, so everything that we see is a direct representation of it, and at the same time not, if that makes any kind of sense. It probably doesn't, but
I mean, kind of like what you're describing almost sounds like it would be like the Upside Down from Stranger Things. It's like similar, but it's not the same. And the way you were describing the second heaven, you rattled off a few descriptors. The last thing you ended on was the ground moving, but the air being different, time moving differently. Can you go into that as far as like, what do you mean by time moves differently? Is it slower, noticeably slower, faster, or does it even exist?
So it depends. It definitely does exist. I've had instances where I've been in the second heaven and I've gained time, where like, it's
There or here?
here.
So you gain time here.
Yeah.
When you were there.
Yep.
So it's almost like time traveling, you're saying, like going forward faster than it should have?
To a certain extent. So like
Okay.
what I mean by gain time is there was a point in my life, I had a job I was doing and I was behind on it and I was needing to get a certain level of it completed that day. And I had figured out it was going to take me 6 or 7 hours or something like that. But God had told me to spend the morning with him. And so I did. And that meant that I didn't get to work until like noon or something like that. Right. And I was sitting there and doing this job and I'm like, well, if God doesn't do something or something doesn't happen, I'm not going to get this bit done today. And I really need to get it done. Because if you're pouring concrete before snow comes, then you have to have it done before that point. Right. And I remember I was working for like 3 or 4 hours and I was listening to a Confessionals episode and I'd looked down at my phone and it said something like 2:15 or whatever. Right. I listened through an entire episode and a half. So it had been 3.5 hours or 4 hours or something like that. I looked down at my phone and an hour had passed. Even though like the episodes had played all the way through. And even though, the day had continued to move the same way that I had expected it to. I've had times where I've done drives from, one place to another and it's supposed to take 4 hours and I get there in 2.5, even though I was still there for the whole 4 hours. I've had instances where like in the second heaven, what I mean by time moves differently is that it doesn't move the way that we typically track it, right? Like it's not in an hours and minutes sort of thing. There was one time I was in the second heaven and it's what I mean by the air feels different. Like it's a connection that I made when I was doing a bunch of research on cryptids, right? And I was going through all these different accounts of Bigfoot, and some of these people who saw orbs, like orbs are a common denominator with Bigfoot sightings. And there was at one point where people were talking about how every time they had interactions with these orbs and they got close to them, they got extremely sick. And whether it was like this rare cancer that popped up all of a sudden, or they were just like nauseous or, whatever. It's because that the second heaven is radioactive, right? It's like, and so these orbs and metaphysical entities that travel back and forth, they are radioactive. So when we're close to them, we get a dose of a particular type of radiation. And that's what I mean by like, I have a level of protection against that, because every time I've been there, like I would say I've experienced some radiation sickness, and that's it. Like I've never had major issues with my health because of my proximity to these things.
This is interesting because, and I know I've mentioned it a few times on the show, but I was talking with a doctor that she told me, because I was given location of where a possible Bigfoot was buried, And when I reached out to her on how to handle it, if I were to find something, she goes, "You need to call me right away." I call her, and she tells me that these burial sites, not all of them, but some of them are radioactive. And
Sure.
there are people who, when they dig them up, if they're not protecting themselves, will find themselves dying a few months later. And she's like, "You need to be very careful. Bring a Geiger counter." I think I have 2 Geiger counters now. But even I was on scene at a location. I can't disclose where I was.
Sure.
But I've talked about it on the show where I went to the meadow where the cube portal popped up for Trey and his team.
Sure.
And we were on scene there for about a week, and we were doing our own investigation. I walked around where the cube portal was a lot, and I think it was the second last night there, I had gotten sick, and I just wasn't feeling good. I didn't throw up. I thought I was going to throw up, but I didn't. And then and I don't get that kind of sickness. Like I don't like, I get colds and stuff, but when it comes to throwing up, I really don't throw up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like a stomachache kind of thing. But when I got home, the first night I spent at home, dude, I spent my night next to the toilet, and I started thinking, like, I wonder if that has something to do with the radiation spikes we were experiencing, because there were radiation spikes. And so, with that information that I just gave you, is there, from your experience, because you mentioned about the idea of portals and stuff, these doorways that are access points, do you think those locations, like where I was at, are traditionally high spikes with radiation?
They could be. So I don't like to say anything definitive, because I'm just a man and I have, a limited ability to understand stuff, and I could be wrong, right? Mm-hmm. There was a point where, okay, so just to frame this whole thing out. So there was a point where pretty early in my conversion, I was doing some level of paranormal research. Like I was going to start a YouTube channel and do all this stuff, right? There was
this was 7 years ago?
Yeah.
Okay.
About that. There was a really interesting experience that I had where I was preparing to go to a location and do kind of our first episode, right? We had gotten some janky cameras and a few mics and whatever. And I had a interaction in my dream with this entity, and I described the place to my wife, and it was a place that she was familiar with. Like, she was the one that kind of got us that whole connection. And she turned pale when I was telling her about it, because I'd walked into like this little room in the dream, right? And there was, it was kind of an older building, slanted roof. There was one window over this bed, and this entity floats up in it, right? It's what I've come to understand is the Hat Man itself, right? Like it's at least a representation of it. The Hat Man, a whole other thing. But anyway, point being is that it floated up. Its skin was ash gray and cracked. Like there was these black cracks all over it. And its skin was kind of flaking off and floating away, turning into smoke on the wind, right? Its eyes were like a jaundiced yellow. It had like a desiccated, stretched mouth and no tongue. But it was mouthing something to me. And it took me a little while to figure out what it was saying. And it said Zayed Jara, right? And at the time when I thought about that, I'm like, okay, that doesn't, whatever, that's just some gibberish. And do a quick Google search. Turns out that's one of the 9/11 bombers. I don't know what the connection is. I think that it was still just kind of a rabbit hole to try to distract and whatever, but maybe it'll bring up a connection for someone else. But that was probably 2 months before we actually went there to film and do our stuff. Actually went there and did our paranormal investigation. And there was a point where I was in that room in kind of this little like closet, attic, walkway kind of space, right? And I was asking, what does Zayajara mean? Like, what's the, asking about that. And I'm editing later on, about 3 months later. I didn't hear anything at the time, but I'm editing later on, and I'm trying to match up the audio with the video. And I get to the point where I was asking about that stuff, and I'm not there on the video, but I'm listening through it, and I ask that question, and there's an EVP that comes through, and it starts playing. There's like a sitar that starts playing for probably a few seconds, and then it's just this deep gravelly voice that says, "It was me." Sitar plays for a few more minutes or for a few more seconds, and then cuts out. And I remember at that point, I'm like, okay, so I stopped what I was doing. Like, I'm like, okay, this is not something that I should be messing with. These things are able to invade my dreams, travel across thousands of miles, give me something to pay attention to. And then when I go there, they reference it directly. I'm like, so what's to say that they can't also follow me back, that they don't have, I'm like, I just don't know what the parameters are at that point. And so I'm done with it. And I'm asking God, and I'm watching a lot of these different paranormal shows, and I'm asking him, I'm like, okay, so what's the deal with these places? Because there's a pattern that comes forward when you start paying attention to them. There's no such thing as a good haunting. There's people who think they have a good haunting or a harmless haunting. And then the more attention is given to it, the more dark it gets, right? To a point where it devolves into eventually demonic activity, almost always, right? And so I was asking him about it, and he told me that these are places where there is a portal, like access that's given, right? Almost like a ley line, right? Think about it like that. And they come into this place and they start like they're, the good hauntings or whatever are a way for them to get their foot in the door. Once they get that foot in the door, the more people that pay attention to it, the exact words that he gave me were that these places are lurid and breed misery, right? They create a higher concentration of access for the enemy, right? And so as these things are moving in, and as they're doing more of their stuff, it becomes kind of a launch point for them to start getting out and doing a whole bunch of other stuff. The more people that come there, they're able to ride on their shoulders and go back to other places. Like it's a just a way for them to move. And so these dark entities have a particular EMF field that they emit, right? So like everything that's alive has it. Everything that is spirit has it. And so there's when they do like the EMF meters and that sort of stuff, I'm like, what they're tracking is like, yes, there is an EMF abnormality here, and it's because these entities give off a different type of energy. And I don't think that there's dead human spirits necessarily in some of these places. It's one of the questions that I still have that I'm consistently doing a little bit of research on. But like, I think that these entities will masquerade as human spirits in order to make our guard lower, right? And so as we are not afraid of them at that point, they can then influence and move on and do different stuff, and so where Nathan Reynolds has a lot of stuff that I can relate to is where he talks about stuff like the shape shifting and being able to go into this other place and having what's that word that he used? He has what he called fractured personalities or whatever, right? Those are all kept in places over there, right? It's like there's different areas and different stages, and the second heaven is like the main focus of the occult for them to be able to access and get to. And it's why it seems like, at least from what I've noticed, that people who are involved in that, and the closer they get to it, the worse they look, right? The sicker they get. They get very if they're not sick physically, they start showing signs of premature aging and variety of things like that. And it's interesting that there's these entities over there that can move into our reality. It's like through access points like that, right? And you were asking about how these places would have higher concentrations of radioactive. It's almost like a door that's open and this stuff bleeds out. And so like when you have that radiation bleeding out, you are subject to being affected by that, right? And so the more concentrated these areas are, and it can be anything from like, this was an access point 5,000 years ago. It was an access point 20 years ago, like whatever. It doesn't necessarily matter when it was. It just matters that they had access at some point. And so when that happens and you're close to it, I don't know what causes like the bleed over, like what dictates when it happens or anything like that, because like there will be times when something happens that's very minor. It's like people go there and they're looking for this experience and nothing happens. And then like, the next day, someone who's not looking for the experience goes there and they're just bombarded by stuff. It's like there's no real rhyme or reason to why, as far as I've been able to discern. But in those places, you are subject to issues like that. And so it's just strange. It's a very different place, and any connections and access points that we have, it's imperative that you be extremely careful when you're going around those places, because it can be very detrimental to your health.
Mm-hmm. So you're describing the first heaven, second heaven, third heaven. You've been to all three?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it seems like the second heaven is how'd you describe it? There was something wrong with it, right? Like it's
off.
It's off. There's something off about it. Is that like the playground as far as you're concerned with this stuff, or are they trying to get to the third heaven? Are they there too? Like what's so special about the second heaven? Like you mentioned about the occult practitioners trying to get to the second heaven. Is there an effort? I mean, I'm assuming you have to go through the first heaven to get to the second heaven. Is that
Earth is called the first heaven?
Right? Oh yeah,
so
duh.
Yeah.
So then let's jump to the third heaven. Like, is that the pursuit then to try to get to the third heaven by these entities? Do you even know?
I don't think so. And based on scripture, which is the only authoritative source that I consider, right? There's essentially the second heaven is where these things all interact. Because if you go through Revelation, the lake of fire and hell in a traditional like kind of Catholic mindset, right? It doesn't exist yet. There is a place of darkness and separation, right? Like the Hebrew Bible talks about it as Sheol or Hades. And then there is, this place here, right? It doesn't seem like there's any stops to them being able to invade Earth through this kind of, I guess you could call it a spiritual dimension that overlays ours, known as the second heaven. And so there's, what I would say, it's like it doesn't seem like it has the ability to go up higher than that, if that makes sense. I could be wrong. The Bible talks about how at certain points Satan goes and presents himself before God, says, where have you been, going to and fro in the earth, walking it up and down, and it talks about how in Revelation he is cast out of heaven. And so I don't know the level of access from the second heaven to the third heaven, but I know that warfare is waged in the second heaven, right? Mm-hmm. And that we interact with it more than we think we do. And so that's it. I don't know. It's a weird place, and it's hard to describe with words, right? It's very different. It's just off. I don't know how to explain it in a way that would really make sense. But like I was in the second heaven one time, for probably 2 or 3 hours. And I was just outside my house, nothing really all that crazy. And I was looking around, and all of a sudden there were all these trees, that they had this odd purple tint to them. Right. And the ground itself was like breathing. is how I would describe it. Like it was moving up and down. The air looked different. Like there was kind of this shimmering, I don't know, almost like wavy type nature to it. There was little like almost points of light or sparks that were just kind of hovering and floating around. And I could tell that there were areas in it that were safer than others. And there was, this particular entity out there. One of the things in that episode that caught my attention was that he talked about how Stephen King was he interacts in this stuff, right? So the closest thing that I've been able to describe this as is like it's Booyah Moon, right? Like, I don't know if you've read Lizzie's story, but that's where this stuff is talked about, right? And there's an entity in it called the Long Boy, which is a very consuming, massive, like worm type creature, right? And it goes through and it's trying to eat people. And there's certain areas of safety and solitude in this other place. But that's about what it looked like, right? Is that it was very similar to Booyah Moon, the way it's described in Lizzie's story anyway. And I was there for what felt like probably 2 or 3 hours. Or no, I'm sorry, 2 or 3 minutes. I got it backwards. I was there for what felt like 2 or 3 minutes, came back down to earth, and I'd been standing out in the yard for like a couple of hours. Just weird, I'm like, there's no distinction that I can make as to like how the laws of physics and all that stuff work over there, but I know that they're not the same as they are here.
I bet your neighbors thought you were weird. they must love you.
What is this dude doing out there?
There he is again, just standing in the yard. Kids, don't go over there.
Don't talk to that guy.
He's weird. He's a little weird. He's a little weird. He says Jesus a lot and just weird stuff happens. Okay, so there's a lot there. There's a lot there that you said. So I guess we'll start with what you just said about standing in the yard. And so when you're standing in the yard and you're in the second heaven, is it like your body is just void of activity? Like it's like you become a shell of yourself?
Yes and no. It's like my vision and my experience with reality changes, where I can still move and do stuff, right? Like I still have full control of myself. It's not like I enter into an altered state or anything like that. It's more like I know that I'm not here, but I am. And at the same time, when I'm in this other place, I know that when I'm kind of like snapped back or whatever, right? Like it's almost not really like a kind of a confusing sensation, but it's almost like you're waking up from something type of thing. It's not like a delusion or anything like that. It's not like how people describe missing time typically or anything like that. It's just like all of a sudden, like I'm there, and my experience with time is like just a few seconds. Like, if we're sitting at this table and if I were to be there for a second, like we could be sitting at this table and I come back and I look down at the clock and the clock is like, oh yeah, you've been here for a long time. I'm like, but my experience with how it happens doesn't feel any different, right? Like I know that I'm still sitting here, but what I'm seeing and experiencing is different. If that makes any kind of sense.
It's hard. It's hard to make sense of it. But so you can you do? Is this something that you do, or is it something that is done to you? Like, can you say, "I'm going to go to second heaven right now," or is it something that like you're pulled there?
Typically, if the second heaven is not a place that I really ever want to be. So if I'm there, typically it's because I'm pulled there.
And but you would say God's pulling you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or actually, well, sometimes there was an entity that I was dealing with, that I've come to know as Cernunnos, right? He's a, stag-headed, Celtic god, right? There was, sorry, there's enough going through my mind. I'm not sure where to start. Okay. So,
I believe me, I understand it perfectly. Like I'm making notes of stuff you said like an hour ago now. Right. I'm like, oh man, we gotta get back to that at some point.
So, this entity, it moves in these flashes of light, right? Its signature characteristic is madness. Like any of these entities that I see and deal with, like their eyes are where it's particularly different, right? Like the nature of an entity that is dark, you can tell because its eyes are, I don't know if it's like a source of power, it's where they pull you in or whatever, but like every entity that I've come up against, it's like when I look at its eyes, I can tell what type of attacks it goes through, what sort of nature it is based on what pervades from it. So this Cernunnos entity, it had eyes that were kind of like a pale green, and they were swirling, and you could hear men screaming in it, and there was madness and like maniacal laughter and like this whole thing, right? And so it would move in these flashes of light to disorient. And I know any like pictures online, you see like this entity that's all standing. I'm like, it doesn't move like that. It moves like on all fours. It has a coat or a pelt of like 100 different animals, and that's just real frazzled and strange. But it attacks with madness, right? And like insanity, that sort of thing. It's a very odd entity, but like it moves on all fours, and it's like its limbs are out of joint, and it moves in ways that it shouldn't within these flashes of light. I don't know how to explain it in a terribly descriptive sense that would make tons of sense, but like when I come up against these things, I know that like there's different levels, right? There's a hierarchy within the kingdom of darkness. The occultic principle of as above, so below is a point of truth where like everything that Satan and his kingdom goes for is a mimicry of something in heaven, right? And so you can find that there's deceptions based on the truth, right? And so they take things that are of heaven, they bring it down, they get people deceived because we inherently will recognize that truth, and then they lead us down a path of deception, right, by twisting it. It's odd. So anyway, the point I was getting to is that there's these places that like I don't know. I don't think of the United States or like any other place I've really been so far as different states. Like I don't really think about the borders and all that sort of stuff. It's more like these geographical regions where I can point to, okay, this place has this principality, this place has this principality. And I've come up and dealt with those particular things in a very direct way for quite a while. And Cernunnos was one of them. It resides over St. Louis area. I'm not sure exactly how far it spreads, but it brings people into this stagnation and madness, and you see signs of that. And I think it's really interesting that just across the river in Illinois, there is the Cahokia Mounds, right? Like it's one of the biggest Native American settlements of the mound builders. And it's sitting right on top of East St. Louis, which is notorious for its danger and its, murder rate and property rate or property crime rate, so it's interesting that the closer these things are to these areas, it seems like the more you see negative effects of it popping forward, right? And Cernunnos rests in that area. And so the point I was trying to get to is during this confrontation, which lasted about 6 months, where I was dealing with this entity. I was at work one day and I was pulled out of my body and snapped back in, right? And so,
like quickly, like you were pulled out of your body and then snapped back into your body, like real fast, or
yeah. So,
I was just making sure that you're not talking about like being snapped back into the second heaven. You're talking about
no, literally pulled out of my body. So okay. Like there's a, like the occult calls it the astral cord, mm-hmm. right? It's like, so I was in my body. It had, it was like March, it had been raining or something like that. And I was stepping across a puddle and I felt myself leave, I looked at my body from about 5 feet away and I snapped back in, and I felt myself hit my own body, and it was like running into a brick wall for a minute. And it left me a little shaken, for sure.
Yeah.
The point that I'm trying to make is that there are times when I can be pulled into other areas, but I trust that, like, when God does it, I know, because it's not like that. It's not violent. It's not aggressive. It's not, really trying to hit me that way, if that makes any kind of sense. There's a distinction, talking about astral projection, right? Like, that is one of those as above, so below things. It's a counterfeit that the enemy uses. And I know that everyone has their differing opinions on it, but it seems like, to me, in my experience, when with where God has taught me and where he leads me, there's a distinction between how God does it and how the enemy does it. And astral projection is the enemy's way, where you leave your body. You're physically in that location, but you're spiritually in other places, right? And you can look at any number of people who have done it and attested to it. Some people call it remote viewing, some people call it whatever, but it's a counterfeit. And it's like and so I don't know what the specific details or laws are around that, but I know that from what God has taught me, right, there is a level where I can enter into like a space in the second heaven where I'm interacting with it, but I'm here, but it's an expansion, right? It's like, and so what I mean by that is like, I'll be sitting there praying or whatever, and I ask God to expand me. And so, like, I'm in my body, but I'm expanded. And so I can see different things going on in different places. Sometimes I go up, sometimes I go out. And my vision increases in that space. Just as a quick example, just this last Monday, I woke up and I was feeling really kind of just low and almost depressed and a little bit crotchety and all that sort of stuff. And I figured, I'm like, okay, it's just stress from work or, because this is the first amount of time off that I've had since like September, basically. It's like working every day, trying to catch up on stuff. And so I was like, no, I don't think that's it. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And I start praying and asking God, I'm like, hey, what's going on today? I'm like, I don't understand. It was starting to storm a little bit. And, and I'm going to the hardware store to get something for a job. And I look up and the trees are shifting, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know how else to explain it. Like, basically, there's a veil between this world and the next world. And there's days when the veil is thin and there's days when the veil is thicker, right? Monday was a thin day, and the trees showed it to me. Like, there's waves rolling across the static, and there's like these trees have this outline above them that's a different color, and it is the tree, but it's not, if that makes sense. And I look up and the mountains are completely covered by snow. It's coming in, and so you can't see them through that, but I see the outlines of the mountains in kind of this like electric shadow of them almost, right? And the Lord tells me the veil's thin today. He's like, so what you're experiencing is an attack of the enemy. So, like, the enemy can send in these storms that have a particular push or a drive to do something, right? And as I was praying and asking about it, he's like, today they're raiding, right? So they're coming in to take captives and to hurt a few people and to try and demotivate the opposition, right? And he had me reach out. Like, I texted my pastor and a few other prayer warriors I know, and we're like, hey, just be aware of this, and we're praying against it today. And it was the whole day was just warfare like that, there was a point where I was driving back from a job or a meeting with a customer, and there's this particular entity from I just call him the shaman, right? he looks like a Native American. I've dealt with him as a Wendigo before. He's appeared as a raven before. Like there's a variety of different appearances, but like the shaman, I'm directly contending with him. Like I see him standing there in front of me face to face, and I'm praying against him, and there's like this compass that appears, almost like it just shows the 4 cardinal directions, and it shatters in front of him. And I'm asking the Lord to, send warring angels and to protect his people and do a whole bunch of other stuff. But after I had that direct confrontation with him, the storm kind of broke. Like it was no longer like blizzardy type weather until later that night. And then all of a sudden it was like, it didn't drop that much snow, but there was a lot more accidents. The roads were much more difficult to get across. And, like we were driving back from a small town, my wife's pregnant. And so we were coming back from an OB appointment, and what usually takes like 20 minutes on this drive took us like an hour. And it was because the roads got so bad. Icy, got ground blizzards, and and right after we got home, they had to shut down the road because of accidents that were along the highway. So there's that would be a point where like I'm praying and I'm expanded, right? It's not that I'm in another place necessarily, as it is that I am in both places. Is the easiest way to kind of describe it. A lot of this stuff, it's difficult to explain.
No, I totally understand. And I mean, no, I don't understand, but that's the point. But kind of like what you were talking about earlier about the overlaying,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's, I forget how you were describing it, but it's probably the first time that I have somebody telling me this stuff that it kind of clicked in my head. I was like, wait a second. So what you're describing sounds like another world. Hollywood would call it, like in Stranger Things, it's the upside down. But, and we hear these stories on the show, and I'm thinking to myself, is this the first time that I've ever considered the idea that this is the second heaven that people are interacting with? And I think it might be. It's actually pretty mind blowing too, because now like I'm thinking about Paul and his interaction. I was like, I'm thinking to myself, oh wow, it's like, okay, noted. I kind of want to based on that, right? So basically, the overlaying of reality and the interaction. There is a question I do want to ask you. I'm probably going to throw a bunch out right now.
That's fine.
It is when you're in the second heaven and you're interacting there, are you physically interacting here in the same manner, or like, are you literally sitting still, but there's stuff going on around you? And it's like, because you're saying like this is this weird overlay. So how much is there a bleed of the two realities where, like, in order for you to interact there on a, I don't even know if this is the right wording, but a physical level, are you interacting here on a physical level? And then like, if you can maybe go into that, but then what I'd like to do is kind of backtrack a little bit, because we kind of just jumped into this, which is fine. But you had a very dramatic experience where, you were considering doing bad things to yourself. And that's kind of like where all this started. And I want to know, like, what has been the commission essentially? Because you're talking about, warring and things like that. Like what is, as far as you can tell, the calling that you've been given to do, and what does that entail? Because it sounds like you're a soldier to me. So I don't know if you view yourself that way or not, but if you could just maybe, before we go into that and stuff, just talk to me about the overlaying of the realities, because I will forget later to ask that question. And I think other people probably have the same question.
So the overlaying of the realities, it doesn't have to be anything in particular. Like there's no like formula that I go through to get there. Right. Oftentimes it'll just be something as simple as like I'll be in church on Sunday and I'll be praying and I ask God to just show me what he wants me to see. And I go up or I go out or whatever, it's like, and he shows me, like, there's this one particular service I was praying and I was asking him, for direction. And I was in church, it's like, and my daughter's sitting next to me, my wife's sitting next to me. And I'm praying. It helps me if I can close my eyes, right? Like because the overlay that I'm talking about, like the veil, like I see it physically. There is a, I don't know what you would call it necessarily, but just full disclosure, and people can look it up and get an idea of what it looks like. It's called visual snow syndrome. It's an extremely rare and extremely new vision disorder, is how medical science talks about it. Typically, it's accompanied by severe tinnitus and renders people almost disabled, right? From what I understand, I have the rarest type where I have tinnitus and I also have visual snow syndrome. And it's basically like, in the 90s, there was like the white noise that was on TV. It basically looks like that, but it's transparent and it sits over everything. And I can see things. Always.
Really? So like you're experiencing that right now?
Right now.
Wow.
Yep. Okay. It's like, and so I can see things in it, and like there's stuff that pops up in it that other people don't see, right? Like I can track where people have moved. I can see movements in it because the static moves differently in those places. Like I've walked into a room before and I saw that someone just left because the static showed a different, like it showed where they walked. And so when I talk
almost
about
like a heat signature,
yes and no, like it moves faster almost, right? It's like, so, and I've been able to see things like, in occult sense, they would call it like auras or whatever, right? Like I've seen things like that in the static above people's heads and like around their bodies. And I can usually tell when people are dealing with something, dark or oppressive. Like it's from what I understand, I'm seeing the electromagnetic field. And so like I can walk up to a person and based on what the static looks like around them, I can tell kind of what their mood is. I can tell kind of the stuff that they're dealing with. I can notice if it looks particularly different, if they're having a real hard time with something. And within that overlay, right? Like that's what I mean by like, it's this overlay, like it's on the table right now. It's on the ceiling right now. It's on the TV. It's everywhere, right? Like it's all over you. Like the static is this, overlay, and it's what I call the veil, right? It's like, and so the veil, when I mean it can be thicker or thinner, there's days where I can see through it in a different kind of way, and days where it's thicker, where it's moving differently.
And this was your whole life?
Whole life.
Wow.
And from what I understand, it was only maybe in 2019 or 2020 that it was even classified as a vision disorder. So it's extremely new. And don't quote me on that time. I'm not 100% sure on when, but extremely new. And so there's some people that deal with it, but like, for instance, the tinnitus that they describe that goes along with it. I hear things constantly that I wouldn't describe as tinnitus, where, like I've heard clear as day, like you and I are talking right now, people say things, it's like, and there's no one there. Like I have to check with my wife fairly often and ask her, I'm like, hey, did you just hear this? And most of the time she says no, but I have to check with her because to me, it sounds so real that I don't know where it originated from. Like I've heard disembodied voices that way. I've heard screams or people talking. I've heard like these, I don't know, tones would be a good way to say it. And it's like when that happens, it's like my ears pop and it's like I can feel like, I don't know, I'm just, it's different for a second, like just thicker around me, right? And I can hear these tones that I think originate in the second heaven. And depending on their pitch, like they change in pitch. Sometimes they're real deep and resonant. Sometimes they're higher. And I don't know exactly what they are in the sense of where they come from or what they mean necessarily, but I know that I've had visions and interactions where God has told me, like, be prepared to hear this. Because when you do, it's going to start, this thing off or whatever, right? Like, and so like things will sound different, things will look different. I hear things that aren't really there in this world fairly often. And so it's like, that's what I mean by the overlay, where like I can be, talking to you right now. And if I were to be in that place, I have full control here, but I'm also there. And so like, if, like I'm driving or I'm talking to a customer, like so there was one time, and I'm still not 100% sure, but I think that I was there so much so that I became, ghost-like here is the only way I can explain it. So like I was in the middle of a fast.
Continue. I just go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I was in the middle of a fast and I was at work and we were putting on the roof that day or whatever. And I walk in after lunch and, I'd just spent the time praying and whatever. And all of a sudden it's like this lightness comes over me so much so that I can't stand up. I physically have to sit myself down. And there's like 4 other guys on the job site and it's almost like I'm just not there. Right. Like I come in and I'm literally like kneeling on the ground and they're just walking around me. It's like they're acting like they don't even see that I'm there at all. Right. The static gets so strong in that moment that I'm almost like, I can feel it. I can see it. Like I can almost touch it and move it. You know what I mean? It gets like really bright. Like I feel like I'm about to pass out kind of thing. And then that lasts for, probably a couple of minutes. And then I stand up and I go back to work and I'm shaky and weak the rest of the day, but no one notices, or says anything like, hey, what were you kneeling there for? It's like, there's probably not a ton of people, that would know right off the bat. But typically if you walk into a construction site and you see some guy sitting on the floor looking like he's having a hard time doing anything, before you go up on the roof, you're going to ask him like, hey dude, you all right? Like, it's like,
you just shoot yourself with a nail gun? Or?
Yeah. Something like that. Right. Like it's, and they didn't seem to notice at all. Mm-hmm. And that's happened to me a few different times. And at the time, like that was the first time it happened. At the time I was, praying against it. I was asking God, I'm like, hey, was this an attack of the enemy? Like, and I was trying to figure out what had happened. And he told me, he's like, no, that was me. I still don't know exactly what he did, but in that moment I was here and also there, right? But more so there. And I asked him, I'm like, okay, well, what do I do with that? I'm like, because like, I can't be up on top of a roof doing something and have that hit me because I'm like, I would fall off or whatever. And, he said, no, this is something that you will be able to do at will when I teach you the process.
Has he done that yet?
Parts of it.
Wow.
There was another time, pretty recently. It was down. I was down in Floribama area doing some work, and I was sitting at the laundromat with my wife. We were just washing clothes or whatever, and all of a sudden, I'm popped up. Right, like I feel that same sort of way, and I look up, and across the sky, there are these triangles that are flashing in a pattern. And a band that's probably, I don't know, about that wide in my vision, right? Just stretching across the sky in a little bit of a wave. And it's these, just triangles. And every time they flash, they like interlock and move almost like gears, probably 4 layers of them. And as they're flashing and moving across, like I feel the same way. I'm really lightheaded. I'm shaky, involuntarily. My kind of ears pop, and I remember my wife looked over and she was like, "Are you okay?" I said, "No, there's these triangles going on right now, and they're flashing and moving, and I just need to pray for a minute and see what's going on." And it was an invitation that God gave me. He's like, "Ask what you want for this area," and so I did. Prayed for a lot of stuff, revival and a whole variety of other things, but. But for a good bit of time after that, probably another 3-4 hours, I felt sick, almost like radiation. It's like I felt really almost like my skin was peeling off, if that makes any kind of sense. And it's similar to like a bad sunburn, right? Mm-hmm. Like when you get a bad sunburn and your skin's peeling off and it's just kind of flaky and whatever, it's like you're shaky and you feel kind of nauseous, had a headache. And it was, and that was something that was hard for me too. I'm like, okay, so why am I experiencing these physical symptoms if it's from God, right? And the scripture that God led me to was a little tiny book called Habakkuk, right at the end of chapter 3. He says that when I heard and saw this vision from God, he's like, rottenness entered my bones, and I was like sick. Like let me just pull it up.
I was about to do the same thing. Habakkuk 3, you said, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to, because this is good stuff right here. Yeah. So you said it's at the end of the chapter?
Yep. It's verse 16. It says, "I hear and my body trembles."
What version are you using?
The ESV.
Okay, let me change it over real quick. Okay, go ahead.
It says, "I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us." That's what it felt like, right? Like body trembling. It's like you're weak. Rottenness entering into your bones. I'm like, that's a good descriptor of what it feels like. You're weak from the inside out. And so like when this stuff happens, like I have some level of training to be able to do it at will, but it's not something that is always like that, right? And in that space when it does happen, rather than expecting it to be an attack of the enemy or something like that, I have to check with God first to be like, okay, so what is going on right here? What am I doing with this? What would you have of me while I'm here? Right. And so it's a really interesting thing to experience, but there's definitely times when God brings me up. There's times when I ask him to take me there. And there's times when, the enemy has tried to pull me out of my body into that place of, and it feels very different. Like it's very violent, very aggressive. And so like I'm within my body entirely, but I'm also there. It's just an expansion.
So I get the sense that this, saying the word journey is not accurate, but I don't know how else to describe it. This journey you're on with God and this new, whatever this is, it seems like you're still learning. You're still
100%.
This isn't something, because it's 7 years old, so it's not like it's something that you've been doing for 30 years. And I just I feel like I wish Colorado was closer, because I'm gonna want you here more often, and you don't freaking fly.
There's a story about that. I promise.
I'm sure there is. I'm sure there is. I want to talk to you about how this kind of all started for you, and the idea that you've been kind of commissioned into this. We kind of just hit on a little bit where, you're still learning, and the idea of being able to do things at will. How did this go from, a very dark time in your life to God? Because I forget how you said it, but you said something about like, God, you're going to have to show me
You're going to have to be real.
You have to be real, right?
Be who you say you are.
Yeah. And all of a sudden we jumped into things, but what was that process like for you? Like, was it that he showed up right away that day, or was it a slow, gradual thing? And how did you get to a point where God's talking to you and saying, you know, this is what's going on. You're now a soldier, you know, like it's crazy.
So in the Bible, you know, Jesus says, "He who is faithful in a little will be faithful in much." At first, when I converted, it was I thought I was gonna die quickly afterwards anyway, because I was not sleeping much. I was not experiencing very good health, and like, so like not experiencing good health in the sense that like I didn't feel strong. I didn't feel like I was capable of moving forward in some things. And like, so when I was growing up and watching my family be torn apart, you know, and I was a Christian, I remember I was, you know, my dad always explains it. He's like, you were 5 going on 35. Like I had a very strong sense that like, okay, I'm here for something in particular. Don't know what it is. And it's like, I would see these things and, you know, no one really took it any kind of serious. You know, it's like I would see these entities constantly. And it wasn't even until just recently that my older brother told me that he saw some of the same stuff. And we had never talked about it until a few years ago. You know, it's like, for instance, we were sharing a room. We were, I don't know, I might have been 5 or some, you know, 5, 6, something like that. My experience and perception of time is difficult. So, you know, anyone who's listening will have to forgive me if I get the dates wrong. But, you know, there was a point, like I said, we grew up in what I call a haunted house. You know, it's like we'd have stuff, you know, different objects and stuff like that disappear. We would have, you know, knocks and banging and, you know, just odd entities hanging around. And, there was a night where we were, you know, we had bunk beds and we were trying to sleep, and we both look up. There's of all things, a Scooby-Doo poster on the wall, right? Both of us look at it and it is moving and distorting, and there's, you know, maniacal, evil looking faces in it. And it's almost kind of like this melted ice cream twisting in it. Neither of us said anything to each other about it until just a few years ago. You know, we were just talking about how the house was haunted and whatever. And he's like, "Wait, you saw that too?" And I'm like, "You're telling me that you saw that?" You know, like, so there's always been stuff like that that's kind of followed me around. You know, it's like there was, I don't know, like a period in my life where I went from being, a Christian walking with God, you know, as a kid growing up in the church. When my parents' marriage fell apart, I was angry and hurt and confused, and I walked away. I'm like, okay, there's no way, you know. It's like, because I not only saw their marriage fall apart, I saw the church turn on us, and we became almost like pariahs or outcasts, you know,
because of the marriage falling apart.
Yeah. And maybe I'm just, you know, looking into things too much, but that's at least what it seemed like and what it felt like at the time. So I had a period of time where, you know, I was trying to figure out some of this stuff. And it's like, so even when I wasn't walking with God, I would see these shadow figures would walk around constantly. There was a point where, you know, we were driving down, going to school, and I look out the window and like, I just blink and the whole world is on fire, right? Like there's fire in the streets. The people sitting in front of me are on fire, but the fire's not burning anything. It's just over everything. It's on the mountains, it's on the car, it's on everything. I look down, it's on myself, and I blink again and it's gone. Right. You know, so there's been stuff like that constantly in my life. There was even a point, I was living at a friend's house. I think I was 16 or something like that. And I was walking home one night, which I frequently did at that point in my life. Like I would walk the 4 to 6 miles or whatever everywhere. And I was walking home. It was midnight or something like that. And there was a point where coming up out of town, there's no more streetlights and it's just dark. And normally it didn't bother me that much, right? Like I would walk into it. There's always some level of apprehension. It wasn't like a fear of the dark. It was a fear of what was in the dark. This particular night, I don't know what it was in particular that stopped me, but like I got up to the point where the streetlights ended, and I knew that if I went further, it was going to end badly for me, right? There was like these entities that would circle me in the darkness. And I remember at that point, I even had to, I called my mom. I'm like, hey, I need you to come pick me up. I didn't explain to her why. I just said, like, I can't do this walk right now. And to her credit, she did. I'm very grateful that she did. And she just drove me up to where I was staying, and it was fine. But like, I don't know what it was that stopped me. It was just like, I couldn't do it, you know? And so like, I've had these experiences, so I went through a brief time of being, a self-proclaimed atheist, which I think is probably the dumbest idea that people can have, is like, oh yeah, this stuff doesn't exist. I'm like, yes, it does. I'm like, you know, you just look at the evidence in general, and there's enough common experience that you can't definitively say that it doesn't exist, right? It's like, so I went from that, and was consistently challenged on it enough that I'm like, you know, okay, maybe there is this other stuff. I don't know what to do with it though. So I was agnostic for a much longer period of time. And in that space, you know, growing up and even to that point, like I didn't have normal dreams the way that people describe them. Like I never had like just weird stuff where like an elephant walks into the room and it's, you know, tap dancing or any sort of thing like that. They were all very intense, very realistic, to the point where I could feel things in it, smell things in it, you know, strong recollection. And I was always fighting for my life when I was a kid, right? As I got older, it progressed into like what I've heard described as night terrors, right? Where I was doing horrible things in my dreams, outside of my own will. Like my body was controlled and used, but I was not in control of it, right? And so like going from that, you know, like the Legion, or sorry, the entity that I described as Legion, right? That's what the Hat Man is a representation of.
Is that your interpretation, or is that?
Yeah, that's mine. So
Okay.
like I could be wrong.
So it's not revelation that God gave you or anything like that?
No, it's just a parallel, because this particular entity that typically is only seen as this silhouette of like a tall man with a hat on. I'm like, I've seen what that entity looks like behind the shadow, right? And it's like, it's and I can quantify it because I know that I've talked to other people who have had the same experience with what happens because it's around them, right? And so this entity, it doesn't have a tongue, so it can't like say anything explicit, but it will whisper things to you, right? It seeks to invade your dreams to steal what's good. And in that space, it starts whispering, you know, things that are like, you're such a terrible person, you're a failure, you know, whatever, just very self-depreciating type stuff. Its goal is to get you to unalive yourself and join them in these like catacombs that they live in, right? It's like a place, it's underground. It's like you got all these different pathways that are in it and all these different caves, but there's just this horde of these entities that are all this one, right? It's like, and so I was asking God what to do about it one day, and I was going through one of the Gospels, and you know, when Jesus casts out the demons and they go into the pigs, where it made a connection to me was that first thing, what do the pigs do as soon as the entities are inside of them?
They rush to the cliff, right?
Why do they do that?
Drove them mad?
Is it? I'm like, because they immediately unalive themselves, right? It's like, so is that a representation of what this entity does, right? And there was, these two guys that they were cast out of, it was, they were cutting themselves. They were mad. They had this insane strength. They were howling all night, it's like, and hanging out in this dead place, right? In the tombs. And so the demons are cast out. They go into the pigs and they immediately rush themselves off the cliff and into the sea. It's like, why would they do that? It's like, so I'm not saying that it is necessarily this particular entity, but it's the name that I've given it for ease of explanation. I
mean, it kind of makes sense in the definition where it was like, we are legend for we are many, and it's like, well, there are many hat men. Like the idea is like, there are so many people who have experiences with a hat man. That are repeatable. People have these experiences and it's like, you can almost predict what they're going to say. It kind of makes sense in that manner.
Yeah, sure. It's like, and the people that deal with Hat Man, it's like, when does Hat Man show up? It's like they wake up in the middle of the night and Hat Man's standing there, or they're walking around and they aren't sleeping because they're plagued by these nightmares. They deal with sleep paralysis. They deal with night terrors. They deal with, it's all this stuff that directly relates to their dreams, and it makes their waking life hellish. So anyway, point I'm getting to is that I had a period of time where that was my experience with the world, and it drained the life out of, and the vibrancy out of everything, right? It's like, so I used to call it the cardboard world. Everything looked like cardboard. Everything felt like cardboard. Everything tasted like cardboard. Like everything was like cardboard. And
was this when you were a kid?
This is when I was, late teenage years, early 20s.
So this is before the whole thing of where you're at.
Before conversion into new life. Yeah.
What was looking like a cardboard then?
Everything.
Like here?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Everything was like cardboard. There was no vibrancy in it. And it's like, basically I use cardboard as a way to describe it. Like, it was dry. It was flimsy. It was tasteless, stale. Like it didn't have anything really of value or worth that you wanted from it. Right. And everything was like that. And so when I converted, I was so sick of the cardboard world. And I told God, I'm like, all right, I'm going to give it one more chance. I'm going to give you my only shot left. I'm like, I'm putting all my hope in you. I'm like, and I had nothing held back. I'm like, you can do whatever you want. I just need purpose. I need you to be real. And so like the first bit of my conversion was me trying to reconcile myself to these experiences that I had for my whole life, and to reconcile myself to the questions that I thought were like these big issues with Christianity, and in that, like, I was not sleeping a whole bunch. I was spending as much time as I could praying, and I'd writing in different journals and stuff like that about the stuff that I was going through, and that's where God started showing up. Like, for instance, there was this one morning, I don't know how long it had been afterwards, but I started hearing him respond to me, right? Started hearing him talk to me. And it really threw me for a loop. It's like a lot of the times he would talk in different ways. It's like, sometimes it was the song that came on. Sometimes it was a journal entry. It's just like all of a sudden I'd be writing something, not like automatic writing. I don't want people to confuse it, but like I would write something and I could look at it and go, that didn't come from me, because I don't write that way, right? Like the style is very different. The whole thing is very different. And so it's like, going through a lot of stuff like that, I was trying to figure out what it meant to be a Christian, what it meant to walk with God. And I remember sitting there going, I would look at how the church today, at least in America, operates. And I would look at these things that were happening to me, and it seemed like such a night and day difference, because the stuff that I was experiencing, while I could find instances of it in the Bible, I couldn't find instances of it in the church. And I was like, okay, well, what do I do with this? It's like, because if this is not from God, then I don't want it. I don't want to give credence to it. I don't want to tell people about it, whatever. It's like, so I had a period of like 2 years where I didn't tell anybody what was going on at all. If they asked anything, I'd just tell them like, I've been talking to God, and that's it. And so,
not even your wife?
No, not even my wife.
Wow.
And, it's like you could see signs, but like there was very little where I was talking about this stuff where you would know the depths of what it was that I was going through, right? And so like in that space, like I had things happen where I was I typically would go to bed at like midnight, and I'd wake up at like 3 a.m. and I'd spend time, as many hours as I could with God before I went to work. And there was one morning, like I was so exhausted, I just could not stay awake, and I wanted to go through the book of John, and I was getting ready to go into it, and I could not keep my eyes awake. And I remember I was asleep, and God read the Bible to me. Right. Like the first few chapters of John, like it's being read to me as I'm asleep. I wake up and I'm like, okay, let me just check that to make sure that that's actually what I was legitimately hearing, word for word.
Really?
Word for word. That's what I heard.
Wow.
And I was at that point, I'm like, okay, I can trust that God is here with me. He's taking care of this. And I was, experiencing, you could call it portal jumping or whatever, like being in these other places and trying to figure out what to do with it. And because I was in this other, in the second heaven so much, I was not expecting to survive it. You know what I mean? And that movement away from the dark stuff, like when people tell me that Jesus saves them, like, for instance, that guy you were talking about a little while ago, I don't want to say details or whatever if you're keeping it close, but, he had a conversion from Satanism to God, right?
Yeah.
It's like when you get involved in that dark stuff, Jesus will save you, but you have to do the work to put in the steps, right? So where I was in that place, I had spent a long enough time in rebellion and walking away from God that I had gotten myself into a deep, dark pit, basically, right? And in order to get away from that, it was a long, really difficult and scary process, right? It's like, and as I was moving away from it, I trusted that God had me and He was fighting these battles. But like, you can't expect to just, be involved in that dark stuff, have a conversion, and then have nothing happen to you at all anymore. And just all of a sudden you're this like happy-go-lucky person, whatever. I'm like, that's not realistic, right? So the first few years of my conversion was just me trying to figure out what in the world do I do with all this dark stuff that's easily you could look at it and go, this is trying to kill me, right? And so I'm walking through this stuff. I'm learning a whole bunch of stuff. I'm studying cryptids. I'm studying paranormal stuff. I'm studying different occult philosophy and like some of this other stuff, and looking at the Bible and weighing everything against the Bible to figure out, I'm like, okay, if this is real, where does it show it in the Bible, right? And as I'm going through the Bible, some things are confirmed, some things are not. And it's like, so I can discard the lies and hold on to the truth, right? And so it was a solid few years of that. Within that time frame, there was a experience I had. I was out, out on a hike, and I was no longer like there. Like I was in both places, right? And I look up, and like there's this. It looked like a ghost town, basically, and everything is kind of like wrapped in this billowing shadow. And I'm seeing people in it, and some are just consumed in this shadow. Some are fairly like neutral and gray looking. And then there's a few people who are just consumed in this like electric blue fire, where it's not burning them or hurting them, but they're like consumed in it. And as I'm walking, I'm trying to figure out what's going on with that. And the Lord's like, those people who are consumed with that fire are
Okay, were you hearing voices?
Yeah.
Okay, I was just making sure it was a studio.
Yeah,
it was okay.
Sounded like it.
All right, it's ladies next door. Okay, gosh, we were talking about this stuff. I'm just like, wait a second, am I being shifted with them right now? Like,
yeah, no. So there's this, I'm seeing all these people. I'm seeing this blue fire consuming people, and the Lord told me, He's like, these are people who are alive in the Spirit, right? Like they have an anointing of the Holy Spirit over them. They're walking, like that's what they're doing. The people who are consumed in shadow, it's gotten to a point where like it feels really tragic to me to see it, because I know that I was in that place once, right? You're directly combating them, right? It's like they're agents of darkness, whether consciously or unconsciously, in their lifestyle and the stuff they do. And so as I continue on this walk, I look up and I see, in the book of Joshua, it talks about how the angel of the Lord went and fought battles for the Israelites, right? And I look up and I see the angel of the Lord, which in my understanding is a pre-incarnate picture of Jesus, right? And I see him standing there, and I see him fighting these battles against these Nephilim giants. And it's like his sword is this electric blue, and every time he swings it, it's like there's like this whirlwind of razors, and these things are just like exploding, you know what I mean, in front of him. And he's standing there, and he turns and he looks at me, and I can't hold his gaze, which I'm proud to say. I look down at myself, and at the time I had no tattoos. And I look down at myself and I see all these different tattoos on myself, but they're moving and they are, like just working. I don't know. They're just on my skin. And like what I see is a panther pelt on my left arm, right? And it's got runes around it. And I look on my right arm and there's like this dark forest there. I look on my left leg, and I think the way I described it was that there's a nightmare bog to tread on my left leg. And I look down at my chest and there's this like flying shadowy raven. And so all of the tattoos that I have are representations of that, because when I asked God what that meant, he's like, there will be trials that you will go through where I'm bringing you up against these entities, and I will get you through it. Right? Like you will fight these battles. And so like, for instance, Cernunnos was the trial of the dark forest, right? That's this one. It's like I have, this feather and stuff like that on my left arm. It's like that was this, it was like this panther entity that I came up against. The trial of, I call it the dead swamp. I just recently went through it. And I think it's done. I'm not 100% sure, but, so the next tattoo I get will be this big leg piece where it'll be like this nightmare bog, where it's like the entity that I came up against is, Dagon, as far as I understand, right? Like the fish god of it's not the Philippines, is it? No. It's the Philistines. There we go. The fish god of the Philistines, Dagon. And then the last one, this tattoo of the raven, like I have that one on my chest, and it's like I was given permission to get that tattoo. Because with all of them, I asked the Lord, because there will be some Christians that say like, oh yeah, well, you're not supposed to get tattoos. There you go. There's a direct contradiction. I'm like, no, not necessarily. Right. I'm like, because you also look at stuff like God told you not to uncover yourself in nakedness, and he had Isaiah walk around naked for 3 years. It's like, so there's stuff that he will do. It doesn't contradict. He's giving a special assignment to those things. Right. And so these tattoos that I have, are not like the way that I think about it. Like it is a statement to the spiritual world, to the entities in it, to be like, this is what I've gone through. This is what I've prevailed over because God has prevailed. Right. So they're like, like a sergeant would have multiple bands. It's like an armor piece that you wear that shows your rank and what you've been through. Right. And so the next one that I'm going to get is it'll be a big leg piece, right? It's like, but the last one that I have on my chest, I had permission to get it early because I won't deal with that entity until the final confrontation with it until the end of my life, right? As far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong, but I don't know if I will be or not. And so that particular one, as far as I understand, its name is Malphus, right? It's a, I think like the third level general or something like that in hell. Like I looked it up one time. It was a long time ago, but it appears as an old man at times. It's the one that I refer to as the shaman. It's the one that appears as a raven. It very strong, and it runs a lot of things. And so like a lot of the stuff that I'm dealing with are proxies that it sends first, right? If that makes sense. But so these particular trials that I go through, it's like I don't know how long they'll be when I enter into them. Like the trial of the Dark Forest lasted for like 6 to 8 months, something like that. It's like, and it was almost a year, maybe 18 months, something like that, before the Panther, which is the left arm, started. And it's like, so based on these different tattoos and what God showed me in that, I knew kind of what to expect. Like what sort of attacks I would be dealing with, what sort of, warfare there would be. And it's like, and so when I start these trials, it's either that God gives me a sense like, hey, you're going into this, just, be aware of it. Or it's like, I will see the entity directly. And, it's like, there's 2 that are geographical in nature and 2 that are just entity based in nature. Like they don't have a geographical location that goes along with them. And so a lot of my walk with God has been trying to learn and trying to figure out what's going on, trying to walk in the way that the Bible tells us to, where we're sharing the gospel, where we're willing to do that. And it's like the ministry work that I've done has been primarily to lost sheep, people who have been close to God and walked away, right? And talking to them and explaining the stuff and answering some of their questions. And there's just like there's a variety of different stuff. So it's like you can be both and, right? Like this dark stuff that I deal with, I think everybody in the kingdom of heaven, Christian, has a responsibility to engage in spiritual warfare, right? Like but at the same point, like you have all these different types of soldiers in the army, right? Like you have some people that are responsible for making sure there's food, it's like, and there's, for every special forces unit, there's like 900 guys who are the support unit behind them, right? It's like, so not everybody is going to have this same type of walk. And to be honest, like, I don't think that you should want it necessarily either, right? If you find yourself in it, it's like, definitely don't run away from it. However, I'm like seeking it and desiring it. If you're a cook in the army, you don't want to be out on the front lines. Like it'll wreck you, right?
Yeah.
It's like, so, it's important to accept where you're at. And so for me, the experience that I've had has been like trench warfare for the most part, right? Like I've been assigned a particular job in God's army where I'm dealing directly with these entities and battling these principalities and spirits and entities in the second heaven, right? It's like, and I'm still not 100% sure what that means for me and like what that looks like. I have enough experience at this point that I have some handle on what to expect and what stuff feels like. And, it's like, and I know that there will be times and seasons where different stuff is more on the focus, right? And, like there was a period of time, talking about that expansion, right? And auras and whatever, like I experienced synesthesia.
What's that?
You see colors that aren't there sometimes it's in music or whatever, but like I will see, just like I walked into the house at one point one day and there was like this bright pink electric color that just kind of swept across the floor and then it was gone, right? It's like stuff that is the colors themselves are very different. Like they're electric. They have this particular nature about them. You know, and it's something you can look at the Bible and you can confirm, like, yeah, all these colors mean something, right? They're all representative of something. It's like, so it doesn't mean that they're not valid or that they're sent from the enemy or something like that. It just means that you have to look at it and then go interpret it and go search the Bible and figure out what's going on. You know, talking about how the Lord has taught me a little bit about that expansion process. You know, it's like I was going through a period where I was praying and asking God, he's like, I want you to close your eyes and just try to picture what's in front of you and overlay it while your eyes are closed. And I want you to be able to see it as if your eyes are open when they're closed, right? Because when I close my eyes, the static is still there, right? It's still over everything. That's why, like, when I'm praying and I'm working on spiritual warfare in some sense, like, it helps me to be able to close my eyes because I can see things. It's basically like turning off one screen so you can focus on the other one, you know? And there was this period where I was doing that, and it was like this orange like wave swept out in front of me and overlaid everything. And it went on for like 100 yards. And that was something God's like, hey, what you're doing is you are practicing the expansion that I'm asking you to do, right? It's like, so you can see things in it, so you can move things, you know, like move in it without having to be there physically, right? It's like, so I'm not entirely sure if that makes tons of sense, but you know, so you were asking about like how I know what it is that I'm doing. You know, it's like God's given me some words, and like one of them, he's like, I made you to be able to walk in both worlds at the same time, right? He's like, and the experience that I've had has been a direct confrontation with the enemy and these entities, and I've seen real results from it. Like there was, it's a painful story. Like I lost my best friend to spiritual warfare. He died just about 3 years ago. And it was the direct result of a confrontation I had with a particular entity. And, you know, so like, I say that to tell people that this stuff is real and that you will see real world effects from dealing with it. And if you're not careful or prepared to pay that price, then you should definitely not be seeking after it, right? It's like, so my best friend at you know, at that point, like, let me, if you don't mind taking a bathroom break real quick.
Yeah, that's fine.
And then I'll get into it.
You read my mind, because I need to as well. So we're back from the bathroom break. And I've been coming, because you were talking about spiritual warfare and how people, you know, Christians, you know, are called to participate, right? And
yeah,
that's something I've been very keenly understanding more and more recently. But I've also noticed that there is a spiritual warfare element to this show and certain particular episodes that we are gearing up to do, which we kind of hit on in the beginning with the technology issues. But even like I've noticed that when I start feeling a certain physical way, like either sickness or lethargic, it usually mirrors into, I really don't feel like doing this. And I learned this years ago. Whenever that starts happening, usually it's because it's an interview I'm supposed to be doing. And I learned the hard way, because that happened to me the week I was supposed to interview Heiser.
Okay.
And I canceled on him. And then he got cancer and passed away. But I had migraines, and it was really a bad time. And I just I started learning these patterns, right?
Yeah.
And even Todd Coconato was here, I think last week. He's a pastor in Nashville. He was in Hollywood and, you know, child TV kid and stuff like that. And he even said, coming out here, he said he experienced some strong spiritual warfare. And he said he almost called to say he couldn't make it. And I was like, I'm glad you came anyways, because it definitely was, because there's been several people who I've had on the show recently that it was my second or third time going around with them because they were canceling on me. And it was like there was something happening, right? And so there is definitely a strong spiritual warfare. And like, the reason why we're talking about this is because when you first got here today, I woke up this morning with a sore throat. I started feeling it coming on late last night. And sure enough, I woke up this morning. I was like, oh man. And like my energy is zapped and I was tired. And I was just like, oh gosh, why today, And then as you started talking, I was like, man, feeling pretty good right now, like I'm kind of, I feel like I'm getting back in my zone. I still feel it in my throat, but my voice is holding up and things like that. So there is a real spiritual warfare element that does roll over into this physical creation. And that's kind of where you kind of left off with a lot of this stuff, is because you were saying how you were engaging in spiritual warfare that had a direct interaction and repercussion on a friend of yours. What happened there?
Well, okay. So this was a good buddy of mine. I'd met him at work, about a year before my conversion. And we worked as a team. We were movers and we moved furniture every, 6 days a day or 6 days a week together for upwards of close to 12 hours a day most days. And, so we got very familiar with each other. We got to be really good friends. And, we had changed jobs together because we got an opportunity to do that because of the moving work that we had done. And while we were at that job, is when I converted. And in the process of that conversion, he could tell that something was off with me, and he asked me what was up. And I just told him, I feel like I'm going nuts. I'm just talking to God a bunch. And, it gave him some pause. It's like he told me, he's like, I thought you were nuts, but I don't really think so. It's just, he took me seriously, which was just kind of the person that he was. But, so we, our wives were good friends, and just like we were kind of this whole unit where we were, just planning on doing businesses together and raising kids together, and just kind of being close enough that we could do that stuff. And so he ends up moving down with his family to Texas. And I was, not terribly stoked about the idea, but whatever, it was what it was. And I remember I had, when they moved, a strong inclination that he wasn't coming back from Texas. Like he would never be moving back to Colorado. Right. And I wept over it, when they had left. And I was praying to God, asking for his protection and for his help and that sort of stuff over him. And about I don't know, it might have been a year later or something like that, I was in the middle of a fast, and God gave me a vision. He was coming up to town for his birthday. We typically would go camping on his birthday. It was in July, so it was a good time for it. So it was June or July, something like that. And so early in June, I was in the middle of this fast, and I was just hanging out praying one night, and God gives me this vision that when my buddy comes up, I'm going to baptize him and lead him to the Lord. And I didn't tell him about it because I wasn't sure. Like I didn't want to manipulate anything. You know what I mean? And so he came up. We ended up talking, and I remember I told God, I'm like, I was telling him about Jesus and stuff that was different in my life, and I was explaining some of the stuff that they were having a real hard time with a lot of stuff. I'm like, dude, that's spiritual warfare. I'm like, this is what's going on, and he ends up coming to the Lord, and I baptize him, and I remember the morning before we were getting ready to go do that, and I told the Lord, I'm like, if this is not of you, then, make sure it does not happen. This has got to be your leading. Like I have no power or capability in myself to go and do this. And it ended up happening, right? And so it was definitely a bit of a high point. Like that's one of the high points in my life for sure, is getting the honor to be there for that and to do that. And there immediately started what I call a spiritual storm. The mountains, like everything felt false, right? Like everyone seemed, kind of paranoid, dealing with anxiety. Like there was just this particular chaotic disturbance that was in the air, right? And I remember, like, I was, it lasted about 3 weeks. I was praying against it, trying to figure out what was going on, and the morning before all this kind of goes down, like I'm looking up at the mountains. There's this one particular spot that's just these white chalky cliffs, right? And it's limestone in the middle of all this granite, right? And I look up, and there's like this vortex that opens up over it, right? And from a different vision that I had gotten at one point, the Lord told me, he's like, that's where the ancients who lived in this area would do their rituals, because they thought it's where the Thunderbird touched down from the sky, right? And so I saw this vortex opening up over it, and it had been like 3 weeks of this just weird pervasive energy that was kind of going on. Felt like it's similar to what it feels like when you're in a room that's full of smoke, just kind of heavy, hard to get a deep breath. There's just something off about it, right? And so I'm watching some of these different things happen and just trying to pay attention to the signs that are going down. And it seems like all of the other Christians that I know that I'm talking to, they're dealing with experiencing the same sort of stuff, like just this heaviness, this impending doom type anxiety feeling. And so my dog starts getting just this weird issue where, like, all of a sudden she's limping, all of a sudden she can't walk. And that went on for like a week. And I remember going out to pray one night, because I'm like, I'm not willing to just let this happen, and people might laugh that I'm going out and praying for a dog. It's like, I'm sitting there and I'm asking God to heal my dog, asking him to cut off anything that might be affecting her. And cause she's getting worse. It's like, she's starting to like not eat anything. And at the time she's like 6, I think. So she's young. And prior to that spiritual storm kind of starting, she had tons of energy, was super, super normal. And so I'm praying against this, and I see in front of me, it's like I'd done a whole bunch of stuff, anointed my property and done a whole bunch of stuff. And I look up and I see on the fringes, there's kind of this like flitting going on, right?
What was it called? What'd you say? Flitting?
Yeah. Like just like almost like when you see someone ducking behind a corner, you know what I mean? Or like trying to hide real quick. And so I start praying against it, and asking God, I'm like, hey, whatever that is, reveal it. And, this little entity kind of moves back and forth, and it's like it looks like a cartoon dancing flame almost. You know what I mean? Like it's like that size, and it's kind of moving that way. And then all of a sudden, like, it ducks behind this house that's across the street, and I'm praying and asking God to reveal it, because it gets like I don't know. It's like I get zoned in on it, and it gets really intense. Like how like when you get adrenaline, like your tear ducts leak and that sort of stuff. Like I'm crying, but I'm not crying because of anything other than just like adrenaline. Like I feel this thing. It's almost like there's just this pulsing in the air. And as it comes out from behind the corner and is forced to reveal itself, it's like this black cloud that looks like the eye of a hurricane. And out of it is coming these flashes of just like this chaotic red lightning. And I start really praying against it, and it's trying to move forward. And like, I feel it pushing, trying to move forward. And I ask God, I'm like, okay, give me the name so I can rebuke this. And the name that he gave me was that it was the beast of the crawling chaos. And so it's trying to move forward. And I know, like, I can't, like, I didn't hear anything. Like, I just have this innate sense that if it were to get into the house, myself and my whole family would die. right? Like we would be, like call it random heart attacks. Like I don't know what would have happened directly, but like we would not have survived. And I rebuke this thing, and it takes a good bit of time, a couple of hours. I'm sitting there just praying against it and resisting it pushing forward. And I remember when it finally leaves, it goes south, and I have a contact. He's like my spiritual father, and he lives down in Texas. I figured it was going after him. The next morning, wake up, my dog is back to normal, has no issues, and stuff seems like it's going to be all right. And that night, we get a call, and my buddy was in a car accident and died. And the entity went south. It went to Texas, and it had been extremely dry. And it showed up as like this thunderstorm. And my buddy was driving and hydroplaned on this. It's apparently a notorious corner for it. And got into a head-on collision and died later in the hospital. And that one, it still hurts, but like I knew that it was because this entity had gone down there, and I don't have any definitive evidence I can point to say like, yeah, this is, scientific evidence. Here's a printout or whatever. But like, talking to his wife in days after that or weeks after that, whatever, it's like there was, a couple of violent crimes, like murders that happened that night. And there was like 3 other car accidents, and this storm went and it was resting over that. And then it left. Right. That was 3 weeks after my buddy, converted and was baptized. Mm. And, going through that and dealing with the ramifications of it, was extremely difficult. Like the attack didn't stop there. It's like that was the flashpoint. And I say that so that people are aware that like this stuff has ramifications that are real. It's like you might lose friends and family to this. Like you might lose things that you don't want to, because of the conflict that you're in. The enemy hates you, like hates all of us, like wants to see us dead. And if he can't get at us, then he'll go after the weakest link, and try to cause pain, try to cause suffering, and so when that entity failed to get myself and my family, it went and it got my best friend. And so, I remember that night, there's a connection point here that I haven't heard anywhere else before, but I find it interesting. After I had rebuked that thing, the Lord told me, he's like, okay, you go inside. I got you. Like, you don't need to be out here anymore tonight. I look up in the sky, Thunderbird flies across the sky. Right. And it doesn't look the way that a lot of people would think. It looks a lot like a pterodactyl, right? Like it's got kind of that leathery skin. It doesn't have any hair or whatever. But it flies across the sky. And then after that, it's like that summer up there was one of the wettest that, like, I've lived in that area of Colorado for the majority of my life, right? Like for 20 some years. And from, you typically get 2 or 3 weeks of monsoon season in like July, right? And it's like, and that's the most moisture that you get. That entire summer was, from that point on, it was raining at least once a day, if not twice a day. It was like one of the wettest that we've ever had, like with this, just the storms rolling through. And, it was a connection point where God told me, he's like, okay, so you saw this vortex. It was a portal being opened up over the mountains. You saw this Thunderbird after dealing with this entity, and it had been this kind of storm, this pervasive feeling for like 3 weeks, right? The connection point was that cryptids are almost like a supercharger, right? Like to these entities, they work directly under them. It's like, and so when they come in, they give it a boost, right? So that they can do more stuff, right? Is kind of how I think about it. And so like, and you can point to things that would show that same pattern. Like for instance, Mothman is typically followed by huge amounts of UFO interaction, right? And within that, people go off on this whole rabbit hole. And like, I don't know if you've ever read the Mothman prophecies, but he has a chapter in there where he talks about, he's been researching this stuff for years, and he's like, this stuff is not physical. I'm like, it is spiritual in nature. He's like, the people that are going off, there's these patterns and recognitions where they see this Mothman and all of a sudden they get all involved in this super crazy alien stuff. They're getting these phone calls from nobody, where they're talking to these, entities or aliens or whatever you want to call it. And it's like sorry, that was me.
That was you.
They are essentially led down a path of destruction where like their family is destroyed or their business is destroyed or whatever. It's like, and they go off in like this kind of crazy mindset where they're just chasing these aliens, right? And taking all of their life direction from like these random phone calls that they get from aliens, right? It's like in the Men in Black are following them around. There's like a whole bunch of stuff that kind of correlates with it. And so it's like the entities, when they show up, these cryptids are in conjunction with the forces of darkness. Like they work within it to supercharge the attacks that the enemy sends, right? Is how I understand it, at least in my experience.
That's interesting. I mean, the idea of them working together, it's something that has been around for a while, as far as the connection of Bigfoot sightings and the balls of light,
Yeah.
That's something that I don't know who originally came up with that connection. I know Wes had from Sasquatch Chronicles had asked that years ago to some people, because he started noticing a pattern. So I don't know if he was the originator of it or what, but like he started noticing a pattern where when people have these Bigfoot encounters, they often have, especially if it's on their property, they have balls of light that are also there. And so you're saying they kind of almost like work together.
Yeah. At least they can. It's like there's the idea of cryptids to me is really fascinating because like there seems to be two different categories to it, right? Like there's people who say that it's a purely physical creature, and there's people who say that it's metaphysical. I'm like, well, why can't it be both? Because you have two different distinct types of sightings and experiences that people have. And it's like when I first started studying cryptids, I maybe had a thought that maybe Bigfoot existed or whatever. And I didn't realize there was Dogman and there was Mothman and there was all this other stuff. And I remember I was going into it, and I, huge shout out to Wes at Sasquatch Chronicles, because like, dude, I'm telling you, I spent probably 3 or 4 months listening to just episodes after episodes on his show, like just going through it. And I was asking God, I'm like, okay, like you're showing me all this stuff, like you're having me listen to Wes's show. And I'm like, what am I supposed to be seeing here? And, because what it started feeling like is after a time, all of the sightings and experiences and stuff that people were talking about, it just seemed really almost like repetitive. And I think that's because it is, right? And I'm not saying that like as a slam on Wes or anything like that, or as a way to discount what people experience with Bigfoot. I'm saying that there's a pattern there, right?
Yeah.
And when I started really studying it and I was asking God about it, he told me, he's like, what does a detective do when he goes into a room full of people and they all purported to see the same thing? I'm like, how does he know which people are telling the truth and which people are lying? Say there's 100 people in there, right? How do you know which people are telling the truth and which people are lying? You have to start getting the stories from every single one of those people. You have to start establishing a pattern, right? Saying like, okay, this person was seeing it from this perspective, but these are the timeline of events that happened with it, right? And this person saw the same thing, same timeline of events, same things that align together, but it's from a different perspective, right? It's like he might have seen it from the balcony and this other guy saw it from the floor. It's like, so you start going through and you start drawing all these connections, so you have a reasonable ability to throw out the weird fringe stuff, that could be made up. It's like it's a way to kind of filter stuff, so that way you have a good idea of what is actually true, at least something that you can work with. Like, I'm not saying that all the fringe experiences that people go through are not true. I'm just saying that, like, if you're looking at it as a pattern or a unit, you can't include it in the evidence because it throws in odd stuff, right? That doesn't make tons of sense. And so as you're going through it, like that's what I started doing with cryptids. It was Bigfoot, and then Dogman started coming up in West's show, and I'm just like, okay, so all this stuff's starting to go on. The Lord has me go through the book, the Mothman prophecies, and like, I'm just starting to connect all these dots, and I'm like, okay, well, what is really going on here? It's like cryptids are of two different sorts, and like there's still questions that I have that I don't have the answers to. And like I say, I don't have any ability to say any of this definitively, like I wouldn't go argue with people and say like, you're wrong. If you have a different opinion or something, I would just say like, well, okay, this is what I've noticed and this is what I've experienced. I'm like, have you thought about this? It's like, how would you make this work into that theory? And so because it's, the cryptids are so much of a metaphysical entity, right? Like I can't remember if it was your show or somewhere else, but there's like
if it was good, it was my show.
There was a guy that came on, and he has like a ranch up in Minnesota, and he has all these Bigfoot experiences going on.
It's Blurry Creatures.
Oh, okay.
With Roger.
It sounds right.
Yeah.
And so, he's going through all this stuff and talking about all this stuff. And it's like, so he's talking about things that are starting to pop up that I've heard in other places, but it's like, okay, so there's these Bigfoots, and it was like the particular spot where I thought it was really interesting. He was talking about like going into the woods, and then like everything like changed and moved, and he saw, Bigfoots coming out. It's like, okay, so these things can interact physically, right? But they're also metaphysical. I'm like, and when they're no longer here, they're traveling into the second heaven. It's like, that's why they're radioactive. That's why they're, able to do things. That's why there's stuff like mind speak that is a part of them, right? It's like, and if you look at it from a biblical perspective, there's the idea that as it was in the days of Noah, so it'll be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. I'm like, okay, well, what were the days of Noah like? It's like, and there's people who are like, oh, well, it just means the world is full of sin. I'm like, yeah, okay, there's that. But what else was a definitive feature? It's like the Genesis 6 narrative where it talks about how there's giants and Nephilim walking on the earth, and the mingled seed of Satan that's mixed in with everything else. It's like Noah was found to be perfect in his generations, right? Like if you look at the Hebrew, it talks about that. And okay, so like in generations, does that mean his bloodline wasn't corrupted? Does that mean that he was sinless? I'm like, it doesn't mean he wasn't, he didn't have sin. It just means that he was perfect in his DNA, right? Like in his generations. And so all these things that are coming out, like, I don't know if you've noticed it, but like, it seems to me like there is a huge influx,
return,
a huge amount of increase, I guess, in these sightings and these dealing with cryptids, where there didn't used to be. And I don't know if that's simply because we have social media and the ability for everybody to communicate, and it's no longer as taboo of a subject. It's kind of become a cultural icon where people like are really into this stuff. Or if it's because, as we're getting closer to the end times, right? Like, and we're walking in them, we're starting to see these things come up. It's like, I think the Bible talks about them in multiple places, but I think one of the areas that we could expect to see them coming forward is that these are, it talks about how in Genesis 6, the fallen angels came down, they corrupted all of creation, right? And like, so what's to say they weren't mixing the DNA and the genetics of a dog with a man and making this entity like a dog man sort of thing, it's like, or an ape and a man, or some sort of flying creature thing with a man, it's like, so my point just being is that I think that as we see an increase in these things, right? I'm like, I think we will also see a correlation in an increase of direct confrontations, and that as these things are moving in and out of the second heaven and the third heaven here, we're going to see more direct confrontation with them. And so like there's like I've been studying Kabbalah lately, which is not something that I advise anybody to do, but it's something, it's the current state of my education where the Lord is leading me and explaining some of this stuff to me. And Kabbalah is the foundation of the majority of occult stuff, right? Like of occult theology or whatever you want to call it. And in one of their foundational books, they talk about how you can create golems, right? Which is like this creature that is made from something on Earth, like a base element, right? And
like a homunculus.
Yeah. So it's or like a mud creature or whatever, you know what I mean? It's like, and so there are these entities that you indwell with a spirit. It's like a type of witchcraft where you make these entities, you indwell them with a spirit, and then you can send them out to go do stuff. But if you don't do the formula or the incantations just right, then you have this thing going wild and doing a whole bunch of stuff that it's not supposed to do. And I don't know how much credence you can really put into that, but I think it's an interesting thought to think that there could be groups of people out there who are engaged in occult philosophies and practices that are trying to create these golems, because it's considered like an upper tier, real high level sort of thing, right? And would that then explain how there's some of these physical things that are coming out, you know, whether it's a dog man or a Bigfoot or whatever, and it's like, and that's why when they are running away, all of a sudden they just disappear, right? Mm-hmm. You can see the tracks, you can see the hair, but all of a sudden the creature is just gone, vanished. It's like, but it was very much so a physical thing, you know? So it's just an interesting thought to think that, like, okay, so there could be one where these things are I don't know if they're like bred or whatever over in the second heaven, but they're clearly coming over here, right? Going through portals and whatnot. And then you have entities that just seem to be purely physical. They hide in caves. They're coming out. They're doing their stuff, terrorizing people, doing whatever. It's like, okay, so if there are those two different types, does that mean that there are groups of people who are intentionally creating these things to go out and cause havoc or pain or disruption or whatever, you know?
Well, I mean, there's even, I think that there's multiple things going on at one time that are semi-related and not so related at the same time.
Sure.
But what you're talking about with people who are creating stuff, that's something that I say me and my buddies, Joel and Ward, we talk about through the idea of, magic, black magic, doing such things. And even so, what you're talking about is like individuals, or maybe groups of individuals doing nefarious things. But there is also like a very real, if you're willing to accept that, mm-hmm. then there is a lot of room to consider the idea of government creating these things as well. And I'm going to be having a guy here in studio next month who killed a dog man.
Okay.
And when he killed it, a while later, he was visited by an agency and he was told that he killed an asset. And so like, there's that aspect of things. And it's like, there's just so, with everything that we've talked about today, it's like everything is complex.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there is no easy way to understand a lot of this stuff. And a lot of it's because we exist outside of that kind of reality. So it's like when you're being introduced to all this stuff, you're like, well, how does this all fit together with what I understand? And when you, like, for instance, you experience, the overlaying of realities. Well, how does somebody like me actually understand that? Yeah. Thankfully, Stranger Things exists, so I have something to think. But like, I'm thinking, okay, the second heaven here, it overlays. That makes sense why certain things happen in people's homes that is unexplainable because it's overlaid. It's actually here. The veil's thin. Things peek through. All that, but it's just like, how do you comprehend that? It's really kind of left up to the individual to how far their brain can take them.
Right.
Yeah, listen, do we still have time?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
I got as much time.
Cool. I want to do an overtime.
Okay.
That way we split this up and stuff. But in the overtime, I want to talk to you about, a lot of the stuff that I was writing down. But I want to write, I wrote down here about you saying that, where is it now? Oh, yeah. You mentioned about the catacombs, the caves, the tunnels. I want to talk about that for sure. And we'll keep going on this cryptid stuff because I want to hear about the Wendigo. I know you mentioned about it earlier and stuff, but I kind of want to hear about that. You mentioned about seeing the Thunderbird, but I didn't know if there was more to that. But you mentioned about fighting Hat Man too. I want to hear about that, and we're gonna start off with Moana. I got something to say about Moana that relates to you.
Right.
So, anybody listening right now, if you're a member, head on over to the Overtime, and we will pick up this conversation there. If you're not, thanks for listening to this episode. It was a really good one, and I really enjoyed it. So, Caleb, appreciate you making the trek from Colorado to Tennessee just to talk to me without interruptions. Those little gremlins, they get you. Or maybe they were golems. I don't know.
Yeah, something.
Yeah.
So the idea of the catacombs and the caves is a really interesting one to me. It's like, talking about that entity that I call Legion, for lack of anything better. When I was there, and I've been there a few times, and I've directly seen.
And where?
In those catacombs. I call them the paths of the dead, right? Like it's this place where I don't know how deep it is in the earth, but as I was walking, it was like this small tunnel, right? And it looks like I don't know if you've ever been inside any mines or anything, but it's hewed out in a particular way. It's not like it's carved out by the water or anything like that. So it's going through, and all of a sudden it opens up into this massive room, and there are pathways everywhere, connecting different levels, going from this place to that. And it's like, and as I'm looking at it, it's probably this pit that is, as far as I can tell, it's bottomless, but it goes on for a long time. And it's like everywhere I can see, there's just all these people hanging out in it. And the rock itself almost looks like, like this spiky limestone, and there's all these holes in it, and there's all this stuff hanging out, different entities or representations of the same entity that are in there. There's everything from women to children to old men to young men, like whatever, like whichever representation is going to serve them best is what they use when they're attacking, right? It's like, I think there's a distinction, at least from the research that I've done. Lucid dreaming is a forceful attempt to wake up in your dream to accomplish some purpose, right? And I think the enemy will use that to mislead people into places they shouldn't be, right? To swear fealty to some of these entities. And I'm like, and it's not really all that crazy to think that, there's warring entities in there where it's like they all have a common purpose, right? It's like, and they're all jockeying for higher positions and power. And so, like, you can see it in nations, you can see it in areas, you can see it in regions, you can see it in really basic stuff. But like when people are subject to that, they're going to be experiencing it in the real world. And so when I was in the catacombs and the Lord showed me this stuff, it was like that was the point, was that he was showing me there's this deep dark place, and they're trying to lead you into these places to join them, to be trapped there, to be stuck there.